You may remember that last weekend I said that this week was going to be a big tournament tactician because we were going into that open qualifier for the Ascent of Targon Invitational. Both of those events have been pushed back 2 weeks, so now a lot of the prep work that I was doing this week, a lot of the behind the scenes kind of stuff, you know, memorizing a new set, all the meta decks, getting reads, things like that, doesn't make for great content, which is why it was a light YouTube week for me. But with those getting pushed back, we are going to be exploring the patch 1.8 tournament tier list that I have put together, sort of a return to the normal kind of format that I do for tournament tacticians, and try and explain what the week 1 meta looked like, what changes we can expect going into week 2, and I think you're going to be a little bit surprised by how little changes from week 1 to week 2. Right off the bat, though, I did want to mention I will still be casting this weekend. Team IQ's Yangzera has come up with Runecup Brazil #2, and that will be taking place in a unified format all weekend. So at the end of the tier list rundown, I'm going to explain how playing in a unified tournament sort of affects that and what you can expect to see different from the standard format tournament that we'll see in a couple of weeks at the Ascent of Targon qualifier and invitational. Maybe there's more decks on here than you expected, maybe there's less. For me, there's a little bit less than I expected. Call of the Mountain shook up the tournament scene a lot less than Rising Tides did, and that's because the 8th region is a lot less impactful than the 7th. That was sort of the first new one. You know, you got to branch out, you got to leave out a region intentionally. Now you're leaving out 2 regions, and we're typically seeing the same regions left out. We're seeing a lot of overlaps on decks from top players, such as Twisted Fate Swain being prominent in just about every lineup that we see. You've heard me talk in the past about how a lot of the times during the Rising Tides meta, it felt like Bilgewater, Noxus, and Demacia were your leftover regions, and Twisted Fate Swain kind of got its niche filled by filling in those underused regions, but now has proven itself as one of the most powerful decks out there, which is really crazy considering that it uses absolutely no new cards from Call of the Mountain. And honestly, you can look at that as a good thing or a bad thing. You could say, oh, that's a bad thing because it means that the new set didn't actually do much to shake up what is and isn't the best deck. Or you could look at it as a good thing and say, oh, well, it looks like the power creep isn't actually happening that much to the point where I can still play my old decks and compete with the new stuff. So it's really kind of how you want to look at that one. Personally, I like that the power creep of Call of the Mountain wasn't so drastic that we're seeing old decks completely thrown to the wayside. But pushing that to the side, what I really want to focus on is the Targon decks. During last week's Tournament Tactician, I had touched on what Targon decks I thought we would see going into week 1, and honestly, the list hasn't expanded itself by a whole lot. We knew that Nightfall aggro was going to be a thing. Now we have a good idea of what it actually looks like in tournament. We know that the Targon Ezreal deck has been seeing a lot of play in tournament, even though I personally am not sold on the success of the deck just yet. But for the most part, Ramp Aurelion Soul is the one that has proven itself to be the most prominent Targon deck thus far. So the format that we're going to go in here is I'm really just going to go through the newer decks. Like, you already know what Twisted Fate Swain looks like. You know what Karma Ezreal looks like, Nab, Deep. These decks haven't actually changed that much in terms of the build of them. They just have gained a little bit more prominence in the meta due to the shift that Call of the Mountain introduced. So I'm going to take a look at the decks that we might not be familiar with, which is just revisit the Targon decks, see what they looked like after week 1, you know, from the day 1 to the first weekend, how these things shaped up. So this is Glop's winning list from Giant Slayer TV's Reckoning that took place during the opening weekend of Call of the Mountain. Now, this is proven to stay on top so far throughout the tournament scene. A lot of people are still bringing this deck. The 3 aggro lineups are not as popular as you would kind of expect them to be, and this deck is a little bit hard for those decks to pick on anyway, because if I open something like a Wording Stone into a Trundle or double Avalanche, I can still pick up 1 win against one of your aggro decks and have a good time going in with my other decks. It's pretty non-committal to the lineup. This is far and away proven to be the best Targon deck for tournaments so far. That is very much subject to change. But importantly, going into this opening weekend of a unified event, I think that this deck will be extremely popular because it has almost no Freljord overlap with a couple of the other popular decks. Freljord as a region always shines in the unified tournaments because it has so many small splashes in so many decks. Think of Nab, think of Endure Spiders. Look at this deck and see how much overlap you're seeing. Avaros and Sentry is really the only thing off the top of my head that we're seeing played in Endure Spiders out of this list. Nab sometimes plays Babbling Beard, but those are pretty low committal cards for you to have to think about when you're going into a card-locked format. Overall, I would still expect this to be the most popular Targon deck on the weekend by a wide margin, especially going into a unified event like Runecup Brazil. That said, this is not the be-all, end-all late-game deck of the format. I believe that title still goes to Karma Ezreal pretty much unanimously. Please do not forget that Ezreal decks exist, as a lot of people seem to be. I know we've seen a lot of Targon Ezreal, but Karma Ezreal is still very much a deck, and I know that while it falls off in the early weeks of pretty much every meta, it will pick itself back up a little bit later on and can still absolutely destroy some of these late-game Targon decks. And of course, Karma Ezreal is not the only one. We're still seeing Deep with things like Atrocity be able to steal games on turn 7 or 8, as well as things like War Mother's Call. You know, a lot of players have been talking about that. It's always been kind of fringe playable. I definitely think it is still as fringe playable as it has ever been. So just keep that in mind. You do not auto-win the late game just because you are playing this deck. And of course, Allegiance Targon is the other way to play Aurelion Sol that we're seeing overwhelmingly, even though this doesn't pair super well into the ramp version. We've seen people experiment with a lot of regions outside of Targon. What do I want to splash in order to get my Allegiance in there for Targon? You know, what 6 cards out of other regions are the best? And overwhelmingly, people seem to have decided on the single combat Radiant Guardian. We've seen other experimentations out of players, but this is the one that we've seen pop up the most, and probably the one that we will continue to see pop up for the foreseeable future, as Demacia is sitting in a bit of an awkward spot. There are a couple of Lux Targon decks running around as well, but those haven't really picked up in popularity enough for me to put them on the tier list just yet. I would highly expect my tier list to double going into the 3rd weekend, and, you know, we'll kind of evolve it from there. But other than that, there's really not much to say about this deck. It's a much more mid-range option than the Ramp Aurelion Sol version. It is sort of the mid-range Aurelion Sol deck, whereas the Ramp version feels a little bit more like a control deck. You know, you're trying to survive. This time you're playing out units. You get that Leona as sort of your backup win condition, which I've only ever really seen the Leona win con work out if you have something like a leveled Leona, a Raven, and then you play a Leona spell from your hand. That's really the only time we're seeing the Leona package actually pick up games. For the most part, you are still relying on the Celestials and the Aurelion Sol and things like that. The Infinite Mind Splitter coming down, stunning out a good portion of the board, can also give you a space to push through that Leona victory, but for the most part, Leona feels a little bit more like a stall tactic, as do the Radiant Guardian and single combat. So this is more of a mid-range option if you still want to play the Aurelion Sol. If you are going for a triple mid-range lineup, this does fit in pretty well. Just be aware that you might struggle with that Ramp Aurelion Sol deck, as well as aggro decks can give you a little bit of trouble, as you don't have nearly as much healing as the Ramp version. So I had mentioned last week that a 3 aggro lineup was probably going to be Discard Aggro, Scouts, and this Nightfall aggro deck. After playing with the deck and testing, personally, I think that I'm going to swap that over to this could probably get replaced by Endure Spiders if you are going for that triple aggro lineup. If you are in a lineup that still wants to be aggressive, but you're putting your Freljord elsewhere, say Nab, maybe this is still something that you are interested in running if you think Scouts is going to get picked on, or if Discard Aggro is a little bit too volatile for you. I could definitely understand still including this in your lineup. Now, this is Black Hole's list. He got 2nd place at the Southeast Asia Trials of Targon tournament, and there's really not much to say about it. It's a pretty straightforward strategy. You know, you want to play your Nightfall cards. I do like the Atrocity that we're seeing in this deck and coming out in general. Pale Cascade can give you some pretty decent Atrocity turns, and you've got some bigger early game units with the things like the Stygian Onlooker and the Crescent Guardian. Crescent Guardian being sort of the main one. And of course, Diana herself can get extremely large with those Nightfall activators, especially when you get to double up on them with things like Stalking Shadow. So I think Atrocity is kind of the missing piece that we saw out of this deck, but overall, honestly, I haven't been impressed by its performances elsewhere. It's still not something we're seeing a lot. I just wanted to include it because it is a unique Targon deck that I wanted you to be aware of. And of course, this is the Targon Ezreal deck created by Teal Red, piloted by Guardia to a 2nd place finish at Giant Slayer TV's Reckoning. Now, I don't think we're going to continue to see this deck a whole lot. Teal Red is great at creating and innovating new Ezreal decks, but much like the Harrowing deck that he created in patch 1.6, I think this is going to get a fair amount of week 1 buzz and then really start to decline as people decide to play other Ezreal strategies. Personally, I still think that Karma Ezreal is far and away the best, but I can't really say that this is something that's going to fall off as hard as I think it does. Personally, I'm very critical of the deck. It hasn't performed very well while it's been on stream, but that's not to say it's a bad deck. It is still an Ezreal deck, and Ezreal decks will still win against a large portion of things, especially given how little Ezreal removal is being played in the format right now. So If you need to play an Ezreal deck and all of your other regions are taken up, absolutely. This is a great choice. You know, you still have the Vi to control the board. The overlap potential is there in something like a unified format tournament. If you wanted to play this and Ramp Soul, Spacey Sketcher is sort of the one overlap card between the two decks. Hush as well, you know, you can kind of cut that from one of them. It would have to be the Ramp Soul deck. You absolutely need Hush in this Targon Ezreal deck. But I think that in this list, the Spacey Sketcher could get replaced by something like a Zonite Urchin and still have a fair amount of success. So it is possible to play this alongside Ramp Soul in a unified tournament like the one coming up this weekend. Just something to keep in mind. But I don't think this is necessarily what you want to be making compromises on going into a tournament like that. So I wanted to save the Vienna deck for last because I felt the need to defend this choice going on the tier list a little bit. This is Pinex's winning list from the Trials of Targon tournament, and it is the only deck that we only saw one of over the course of the first weekend that I felt compelled to include in the tier list. First of all, it's a great option for players who are adverse to running Aurelion Sol or Ezreal for whatever reason. Maybe they think that the weaknesses are too exploitable, maybe they just personally don't like that playstyle. I think this gives you a great option and is sort of this secondary Targon Allegiance deck that we get to see. I don't think you're going to be able to run this in the unified tournaments coming up this weekend. I think that Mystic Shot is just a little bit too impactful for every Piltover and Zon deck. We almost never see Piltover and Zon get overlapped in those kinds of tournaments due to the prevalence of Mystic Shot in so many of those decks. But if you are looking for a mid-range celestial generating value kind of deck that doesn't go all in on that Aurelion Sol top end, this is 100% the deck for you. And I think the only reason we saw so few of this deck is because nobody had really thought about it. I think this is one of those decks that is going to pick up steam going into the next coming weeks, and we'll continue to see more and more of this deck or decks like it going into the future weeks. And outside of that, all of these decks look pretty much the same. Twisted Fate Swain has made almost no adaptations. Karma Ezreal's changed a little bit. Nab has gotten a little bit more aggressive, but really, for the most part, not changed. Deep has probably changed the most, so I do want to highlight this one. We are overwhelmingly seeing players going for things like triple Lore of the Depth to try and keep up with those Targon decks, get their sea monsters down a little bit more aggressively. We're really only seeing Abyssal Eye and Devourer these days. No one's really including Shipwreck Hoarder. We have seen a couple Terror of the Tides to try and close out games a little bit earlier, but outside of that, this is sort of the new standard for things like the Deep deck. Shroud of Darkness, not necessarily going to be sticking around. That is just a little bit of a tech out of Hack a Cat, who did pick up a win in the OLS, but the 3 Lore of the Depths is really what I wanted to highlight for you. This has overwhelmingly become the standard for deep decks, and I think it will continue to be the case going into the future, as well as the double Atrocity. You're really looking to close out games a little bit quicker than you used to. You still don't compete with things like Ramp Asol, and a Maokai Wincon doesn't always get online before they're able to get down their Aurelion Sol, and they don't necessarily need 4 turns to end the game if they've got a leveled Aurelion Sol out. Then coming back over onto the tier list, I do just want to highlight Trundle Swain for you guys, just so that I can show you what it does look like again. Obviously, Twisted Fate Swain is overwhelmingly the more popular Swain deck of the format, but if you do want to commit your Bilgewater elsewhere for some reason, maybe you just really think that Deep is one of the best decks in the format, go ahead, play Deep, and then you can still have your Swain deck on backup. I do really like Swain's position in the meta. I think that it's got a pretty good shot against just about everything. Personally, when I played Trundle Swain, I was struggling with the Ramp Aurelion Sol decks, but I was actually having a fair amount of success against the mirror, or the pseudo-mirror rather, of the Swain Twisted Fate. So, you know, if you are trying to craft a lineup to beat Swain Twisted Fate, as it is one of the more popular decks in the format, if that's what you want to decide you want to pick on, you are going to have a bit of an uphill battle for yourself, but I do think that a deck like this is a pretty good starting point, as the Trundle can be difficult for a deck like that to remove, and because you have Iceveil Archer, Culling Strike, as well as Arachnoid Sentry Ravenous Flock, you have more removal in the deck than just about any other deck in the game. Feels really, really good, as well as, of course, the Leviathan Swain, a late game win con, and Trundle can just go ahead and help you close out games pretty quickly. Avalanche and Kindly Tavern Keeper shore up your aggro matchup, and overall, you've got a good widespread of matchups. You just don't handle that Ramp Soul deck as well as the Twisted Fate Swain does, in my experience. And then, of course, we rounded out with things like Scouts and Endure Spiders. While I haven't actually caught any lists from Endure Spiders in tournament, that's why that field is blank. Not a whole lot about the deck has changed. Of course, Stalking Shadows was a phenomenal addition. Some people are even electing to play things like a single copy of Shroud of Darkness so that you have that way to protect the Endure the turn that it comes down. You are a little bit more likely to get the attack off and not necessarily have to rely all in on the Atrocity, as there are a fair amount of things like Hush that are going to stop it. But honestly, Hush does not take the deck out of the meta by any means, and I think that Endure Spiders is still one of the best decks out there. I just couldn't put it in tier 1 because it didn't have any showings in week 1, but I think that going into week 2, especially going into a unified format tournament, Endure Spiders is going to come out really big this weekend, so be aware of that one. Test accordingly. As I had mentioned, bit of a lighter week this week than I expected because the Trials of Targon qualifier has been pushed back, but Runecup Brazil will be happening, and it is in the unified format, so we do get to see some higher power level, and with so many different regional identities in Targon, I'm actually really excited to see if we can see players come out and have success with multiple Targon decks employing different strategies. It is going to be a little bit weird with Lulu gone, but Tarek Lee Sin is something that we've seen, a couple of players experimenting with, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of overlap with any other Targon deck, so fingers crossed, maybe we get to see something like that. Maybe Hush is too generic of a card. You need it in too many Targon decks, and it sucks without it. I don't know. I'm going to find out this weekend, and you should be there too. So until next time, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. All my socials will be down below, as well as a link to the tournament tier list. And as always, good luck in your tournaments.